This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Even before Donald Trump officially took back the White House, we all knew that this was coming.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon.
He made it part of his campaign. He told voters that if they elected him, he'd pardon the people who stormed the Capitol in 2020, trying to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election.
What they've done to these people is outrageous. There's rarely been anything like it in history, in the history of our country.
But even with that benefit of foresight, the news still came as a shock.
To be honest, I was pretty stunned.
Josh Kaplan is a reporter over ProPublica.
Every indication, especially since the election, seemed to point to the fact that it was not going to be a blanket approach. It was going to be a case-by-case basis. Even Vice President Vance, roughly a week ago, said that it was obviously, quote unquote, a bad idea to pardon people who had committed violence that day. It was an incredibly brutal day. Roughly 140 officers were injured. The violence we're talking about is things like plunging a taser into a police officer's neck when he's on the ground.
Over the past several years, Josh has been reporting on January 6th and on the groups who directly benefited from the pardons and commutations, right-wing militias like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and the American Patriots 3%.
The militia movement historically was an anti-government movement. But really, starting around 2016, when Trump first came into the White House, we start seeing that change. These are paramilitary organizations that a lot of the time view themselves as supporting the agenda of the president. They're not necessarily in lockstep with Trump, but they are deeply aligned with him and take many cues from him.
So these 1,500 pardons, they represent a wide range of people. Some of them broke into the Capitol, some were arguably responsible for the deaths of Capitol police officers, and then there were the national leaders of some of these hardcore militia movements. Who should we be paying attention to in here?
There's certainly, at minimum, an arm's length relationship, particularly the then leaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes. These were some of the most important and influential figures in the militia movement, but now they have a legitimacy and a certain cachet that they never could have dreamed of. They're returning to society after having been sentenced to 2 decades, roughly, in prison. And it's unclear, only a couple days out, what they're going to do going forward. But I think that there's they have the possibility to have an influence that would have been unimaginable otherwise.
Josh, even before the pardons, your reporting shows militia membership was back on the rise. January 6th was even a rallying point for some people to join. What effect could Trump's pardons have on the recruitment effort?
The ramifications could be massive. I think it'd be difficult to overstate how significant this is. This sort of messaging has a very concrete impact on militias' size and on militias, what they do, how bold they feel. And there is simply no precedent for this kind of message of support and protection coming from the White House. And how it will be interpreted, I think it's fair to say, is that this is a license for more extreme action. You can commit violence and potentially go unpunished as long as you're doing it for the quote-unquote right cause.
Today on the show, are American militias here to stay? I'm Rob Gunther, sitting in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Is there part of your personal story you've been wanting to revise in 2025? Maybe you're just ready for a plot twist. Every January brings 365 blank pages waiting to be filled. Life is not about resolutions that fade by February. It's about picking up the pen and becoming the author of your own life. And therapy can help you write new chapters and create the meaningful story you deserve to live. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's fully online, making therapy more accessible, convenient. BetterHelp has a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. If you feel like your matched therapist isn't the right one for you, you can easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/whatnext today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/whatnext. This episode is brought to you by Home Chef. The holiday season is over, but cold weather is sticking around. Luckily, Home Chef is delivering hearty recipes and comfort foods to help you stay cozy. You know what I realized Home Chef is good for recently? A house like mine, where only one of you likes meat, and that person is a teenager. Home Chef happily sent over a big box of beef and some easy-to-prepare recipes, and while a bunch of us were digging into some vegetarian chili, my teenager was taking a break from his homework and making himself stir-fry. Easy for him, easy for me. Users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. Whether you prefer classic kits, quick recipes, oven-ready options, microwave meals, or a family menu, Home Chef has over 30 options a week and serves a variety of dietary needs. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering What Next listeners 18 free meals, plus free dessert for life, and of course, free shipping on your first box. Go to homechef.com/whatnext. That is homechef.com/whatnext for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. homechef.com/whatnext. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert.
Josh, I was hoping you could talk about what the militia groups were like before January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, so the kind of modern iteration of the militia movement really started around 2008 when Obama was elected, and the financial crisis, other factors that led to this upsurge. And there was quite a bit of activity during the Obama years, but the turning point in this story is 2020. We have first the COVID lockdowns, which, are kind of every conspiracy theory the militias have been afraid of forever coming true. The government's trying to keep you in your home. There was this massive backlash to COVID restrictions that Trump fanned the flames of by tweeting, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota. And then we have the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd. And you have militias in the streets, patrolling with guns, fighting with protesters. And then finally, you have claims of a stolen election. That led to a series of protests, leading up to January 6th, Stop the Steal protests, where militias were a major presence and were also committing violence in the streets of American cities. So militias gained a huge amount of momentum in this period.
What was the makeup? What were the biggest groups in the U.S.? How big and active were they?
I think the core groups were, it was the Proud Boys, it was the Oath Keepers, and it was a kind of loose coalition of militias known as the 3%ers. And so that includes big militias like American Patriots 3%. They were on the rise, feeling very emboldened, active in a kind of public-facing way that we really hadn't seen before the movement. This all culminates in January 6th and the storming of the Capitol, when groups like the Proud Boys, according to the Department of Justice, led the on-the-ground efforts to breach the building that day. They brought large, organized forces to Washington, and they were at the forefront of every major breach of the Capitol's defenses.
Once Biden was in office, lots of these people received lengthy prison sentences, including high-level leaders. What effect did that have on militia membership?
Militias were in a state of crisis. And part of the reason for that was the official response. Biden's DOJ took a shock and awe approach to arresting rioters. So people were afraid of going to prison. Also, Facebook and other big tech companies were cracking down too, and that took away many militias' most important recruiting tool. And part of it was also, though, that January 6th created a real stigma to being in a militia, including among many MAGA conservatives. People were losing friends, losing their jobs over their militia ties. And what this all amounts to in the militias I've looked at most closely is that they were hemorrhaging members, and other militias collapsed entirely. And so, there was this stretch of time in 2021 where even leaders in the militia movement, who were tend towards bravado, frankly, were saying to each other in private, our militia, our movement might not be able to survive this backlash.
I was struck by your reporting. You did that piece over the summer that looked at AP3 in particular. And after this period that you just described, where there was sort of a stigma, I was struck by the fact that for a few militia members that you reported on in particular, J6 then turned into something of a rallying call for potential recruits.
Yeah, things turned around way faster than these guys could have hoped. And I mean, there's a couple important factors there, but I think maybe the biggest is this remarkable change in the political climate. Within a few months after January 6th, the rioters went from pariahs in mainstream Republican politics to having prominent GOP figures from Trump on down talk about them as patriots, as political prisoners. And I think that gave a lot of people the green light to feel comfortable getting involved in the militia movement, even inspired them to join for the first time. As you were just saying, I've seen this documented many times. And so before long, some of these major militias like AP3 were off of their deathbed and bringing in so many new recruits that they were struggling to keep up with it all.
Josh's most recent reporting focuses on one of these new recruits, a man named John Williams. Williams joined multiple militias after the January 6th insurrection, AP3, the Oath Keepers, and he rose up the ranks to levels of national leadership. But there's a twist. He joined them so he could infiltrate them and then feed whatever he learned to the media. Josh spent 2 years digging through those files.
One of the things that happened after January 6th was militias became much, much more careful about keeping their activities out of public view. And John Williams was able to get extensive access to the senior leadership of AP3 and of the Oath Keepers, and sent me this trove of documents that I was able to verify that gave this kind of extraordinary, detailed, candid, inside view of the militia movement the past few years. it really showed how these militias were able to navigate a recovery and expand dramatically while uniting convicted criminals with doctors, lawyers, active duty police, and U.S. soldiers, and that they were still conducting dangerous vigilante operations that, until John came around, they managed to keep a secret. So that's everything from rounding up migrants at the border in armed patrols, trying to crack down on voters casting absentee ballots, doing surveillance on local journalists and activists, assaulting Black Lives Matter protesters. And there was also this drumbeat in these internal files of very heated debates over whether they should escalate things even further and commit acts of mass political violence.
You know, after January 6th, I feel like there was a period where the public was really, if not worried about militias, they were talking about them. They were in the news, they were in the headlines. And then after the prosecutions, maybe public attention seemed to fade. But your reporting makes it clear that these groups were still organizing. They were still powerful. They're still on the upswing. Did we, in the public, in the media, were we distracted? Were we complacent?
I don't know if I would say that necessarily. I think part of it is it just became a whole lot harder to see what was going on. If you were hanging out in the right quarters of the internet, you had a sense something was going to happen on January 6th. A lot of the talk about that day was out in the open. Militias learned a lesson from that. They became a lot more careful about security, about keeping what they're doing out of public view. When these groups do commit violence, often it's not necessarily traced back to them until many years later, if ever. Like, for instance, this one example I dug into was in the 2022 midterms, AP3 conducted this national operation to stake out ballot boxes and try to intimidate people who were casting absentee ballots. And a member of the militia who'd been in a leadership role got in a confrontation with a woman outside a ballot box in Arizona. He had a handgun. He was wearing a tactical vest. And this sparked a national news cycle. But the militia tried to avoid having that incident traced back to them. And they were successful for a very long time. It looked like this was the act of a lone wolf. There's this kind of constant contemplation of violence where it's difficult to predict as a reporter or as an FBI agent when it's going to turn into something, turn into violence in the real world. But it sometimes, again and again, it does. And the larger and more emboldened these organizations become, the more likely it is that we see that on a regular basis.
We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by Built. If you earn points on groceries, travel, and practically everything else you buy, why not consider earning points on one of the biggest monthly expenses, rent? Built changes the game by letting renters earn high-value points on rent. There's no cost to join Built, and as a member, you'll earn valuable points on rent and on your everyday spending. Built points can be transferred to your favorite hotels and airlines, and even the ones you haven't heard of. There are over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels and properties around the world you can redeem your Built points toward. Points can also be redeemed toward a future rent payment and unique experiences that only Built members can access. So, if you're not earning points on rents, you've got to ask yourself, why not? Start earning points on rents you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/whatnext. That's joinbilt.com/whatnext. Be sure to use joinbuilt.com/whatnext to start earning points on your rent payments today.
This episode is brought to you by NRDC. Our nation's environmental safeguards face their gravest challenge ever: The new Trump administration is moving quickly to dismantle decades of protections for our clean air, water, and public lands. The Natural Resources Defense Council has proved it can stop these attacks. NRDC filed the first environmental lawsuit against the previous Trump administration and maintained a blistering pace, filing 163 legal challenges and winning victories in nearly 90% of resolved cases to protect wolves, bees, and other endangered species, block the Keystone XL pipeline, regulate chemicals hazardous to our health, and more. Now, NRDC is launching the legal fund to stop the Trump agenda. For a limited time, all donations will be doubled to help power their strongest legal defense of our environment yet. From climate protection to endangered species, what we do now will determine the world our children inherit. Make your match gift at nrdc.org/podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
So these groups were on the upswing before the pardons, then the pardons landed. What do you think the reaction within the groups has been so far?
They're thrilled. This is bringing us into uncharted territory. But, they are celebrating this as they're back on the scene. Militia members are talking about how they're expecting this to be a boon for their recruiting, that, people who had been afraid to join because they feared arrest, they feared scrutiny from the federal government, now are going to feel invincible. And so, it's going to have a very real, concrete impact on the direction of these militias, how emboldened they feel to take aggressive action. I think how this is going to be interpreted by a lot of people in and around the movement is that you can commit violence and potentially go unpunished as long as you're doing it for a cause that the president approves of.
The New York Times had some reporting last week on Wednesday that both Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes, they have their eyes on revenge, right? They're hoping that the DOJ might go after the prosecutors that landed them in prison. It's not just about the groups and what they can do now, right? It's a complete turning of the tables. How worried should people be about revenge from Trump's government?
This is what he campaigned on, retribution. He's been saying for months that he hopes to use the force of the federal government to get revenge on people he sees as political enemies. And that includes people who investigated January 6th, the select committee, for instance, people like Liz Cheney. And obviously, it goes a lot further than that, too, everything from the criminal investigations into Trump himself to, potentially just people who've been critical of him. And, obviously, it remains to be seen what this looks like in practice. But, if he carries out half of what he said he was going to, it's going to be a really fundamental change in American society, I think. And I know it's something, we at ProPublica are watching extraordinarily closely.
Your reporting points out that these groups and their recruitment efforts took a hit during the Biden years, in large part because Facebook in particular made it difficult for the militias to recruit. But even before the election, you saw that starting to change. And now Mark Zuckerberg seems to have loosened even more restrictions in the name of free speech. So how do you see the future of these movements playing out across social media?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I mean, getting inside these groups, they were worried about the DOJ crackdown. They actually, in some cases, talked a lot more about the crackdown from Facebook. the kind of modern iteration of the militia, of these large national organizations that can send a large contingent of people to the Capitol on January 6th, for instance. Social media is their lifeblood. It's how they grow. It's how they reach people. It's how they reach enough people in enough places to expand to something that really can be a force in national politics. The founder of this militia I was looking at, AP3, described it as their greatest weapon, what had gotten them to become one of the largest militias in the United States. Facebook's crackdown in late 2020 and after January 6th made it much, much more difficult for these organizations to grow. But over time, the militia started to observe that Facebook was loosening its controls, in that they were able to have significant success recruiting through social media again, to the point where they're getting as many as 50 new recruits each day, which does not take very long to become a very significant number. And that was at a time when AP3 was still on Facebook's official list of banned dangerous organizations. That's Facebook's word. This kind of shift in rhetoric from Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know what that's going to look like in practice yet, but if it means that they scale back their enforcement activities that already were, to say the least, deeply imperfect, it could go even further in putting the wind back into the sails of this movement at a very volatile time.
I'm thinking about last week at the inauguration festivities, Elon Musk came out. He gave a hand gesture which is identical to a Nazi salute. While the meaning of that is being debated across, elements of the press, what I find notable is how right-wing figures in the U.S. have received that message. We saw last week at Elise Stefanik's confirmation hearing in the Senate for UN ambassador, Senator Chris Murphy just went through the list. He went through the list of far-right groups, animated by it online, energized. And I guess my question to you is, the pardons, the salute, the messaging coming out of the White House, it all seems to be a message of encouragement. It's like we're seeing the stand back, stand by comments amplified. How do you expect these groups to rally and grow in the months and years to come?
Something that experts have been talking about for months, well before these sweeping pardons that really changed the game, frankly, is immigration. Militias have a long and at times very bloody history of doing armed vigilante operations to try to crack down on immigrants. And with signals of at least tacit support coming from Trump, and when he starts to execute his immigration plan, I know a lot of people who follow this closely have been worried that could lead to militias taking action in a more widespread and more aggressive way, trying to insert themselves into this sort of immigration action. But you get inside these groups, they're always talking about committing acts of terrorism. And, not just idly, they're having logistical debates. The conversation in these organizations, often isn't about whether they should commit violence. It's when. Is the time right? Is this the moment for us to commit mass political violence? The upsurge of activity and momentum we had in 2020 then culminated in January 6th. And, the last kind of major surge in militia activity before that was really the early 90s. That culminated in the Oklahoma City bombing, which remains, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks on American soil. Journalists, I don't think, are great at making predictions, so I don't want to be alarmist and say that something's definitely going to happen or that I have any sense of the time horizon. But I think it's very reasonable to be worried about if these groups grow rapidly and feel more emboldened than, they have reason to feel more emboldened than they ever have. And the potential for that translating into violence against American citizens or non-citizens is very real.
Josh Kaplan, thank you so much for your reporting, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, thanks so much for having me, Rob.
Josh Kaplan is a reporter with ProPublica. His latest work, The Militia and the Mole, came out earlier this month. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Rob Gunther, in for Mary Harris. You can find me at Blue Sky. I'm at @1RobGunther. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.